Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian. I'm here today at the James Julia Auction House, and I'm taking a look at some of the guns that they're putting up for sale in their upcoming March of 2016 auction. Now, I'm looking at, this time, an example of the third most common Confederate Marshall revolver. So we can kind of consider that there are two different groups of Confederate revolvers or handguns. On the one hand, you have the guns that were actually legitimately contracted by the Confederate States of America. And on the other hand, you have guns that weren't contracted specifically, but were bought commercially by soldiers and actually saw military use nonetheless. Now this falls into that first category. These were the result of a specific contract with the CSA. So this is a Spiller and Burr, and there are actually three characters involved in this. We have Edward Spiller, he actually lived up in Baltimore, Maryland before the war and was a businessman. He ran a commission business. And apparently, from the record, it seems he was kind of a loudmouthed, very Southern-friendly sort of businessman. And when the war broke out, he kind of had to hot-foot it down to the South because his opinions weren't really going to do him very much good in the North. So he moved down to Richmond, and there he ran into David Burr, who was an engineer building steam engines. So you can kind of see where this is going here. We have the businessman and the engineer. Yeah, that's kind of what you need to start a company. So there's a third guy involved in this story, and he's almost more important than the other two, although his name didn't end up on the guns. His name is Lieutenant Colonel James Burton, and he held a number of positions, but most importantly for this, he was actually in charge of the CSA's armory system. So there you go. You know, you think about it, if you're setting up a company to manufacture arms for the government, and one of your founding partners is the guy who's responsible for procuring arms for that government, you've kind of got it made, right? Well done. In fact, on top of this, Burton was a remarkably accomplished gunsmith, gunmaker on his own right. He had been chief engineer at the Royal Small Arms Factory in Enfield. He had also been superintendent of the U.S. Arsenal at Harper's Ferry. He knew his stuff. And between him and Spiller and Burr, basically the setup was Burton, the government man, would arrange for a contract with the CSA for guns, for 15,000 revolvers to be purchased. And he would be responsible for getting the machinery set up and running. And then in exchange, he was paid a lump sum, actually a couple of lump sums as the project progressed, and he would get a third of the business's profits. Spiller and Burr, on the other hand, were primarily at this point responsible for fronting what money they were not able to get from the Confederate government. So the CSA ultimately put up about $60,000 in front money, which is a really sizable sum at the time. And Spiller and Burr were responsible for putting up that much again each. So they put up personal security for another $120,000, which is an immense amount of money. So at this point, things start to kind of go sideways. The actual contract with the CSA specified copies of the Colt pattern revolvers. And this is not a Colt pattern revolver. The Spiller and Burr is actually a copy of the Whitney revolver. Well, there isn't any specific evidence, but we can pretty well determine what happened here. Spiller and Burr came across a guy named Robinson who had set up a factory to make Sharps type carbines and Whitney revolvers. He never actually made any revolvers, but he did sell his factory to Spiller and Burr. And it's pretty obvious to see that what happened was their plans for making Colt pattern revolvers got thrown in the garbage when they realized that here they had the opportunity to purchase a complete factory with all the tooling and effectively the whole technical package for making Whitney revolvers. So forget that. We're not going to try and engineer our own new product. We'll just make this thing that Robinson had already done the background work on for us. So that's how this pistol changed from being a Colt copy to a Whitney copy. Now, the first 4,000 guns were supposed to be delivered in December of 1862. What they ultimately did deliver in December of 1862 was 15 guns total. That was it. And they sent them to Confederate Ordnance, who sent them back and basically said, yeah, there are a bunch of changes we need you to make. So we'll look at those changes in a moment when we look at the gun up close. But that didn't go well. So they went back, and by June of 1863 now, they delivered another 40 guns, which is, I mean, we're supposed to be getting a lot of guns in here, and there's not much coming out of this factory. Of those 40 guns, 7 were accepted and 33 were rejected for flaws, among other things. Cylinders, the chambers didn't line up with the barrel, which is kind of a problem. Excessive cylinder gap, kind of a problem. Spiller and Burr were having a really hard time actually getting these guns produced. And Burton too. For all of his technical expertise, that's not going to really help him from the problems that beset the Confederacy on manufacturing anything. They had massive shortages of raw materials. A gun like this, you would want the cylinder made out of steel. They were able to make one shortcut right off the bat by using a cast brass frame. By the way, these frames were still rather weak, and of the ones that are known, it's not that uncommon for them to be bent or damaged on the top strap, where pressure is the greatest. But ideally, they really needed steel for the cylinders. They couldn't get steel, so they ended up using twisted iron instead. The idea was you could take a bar of iron, and by twisting it, you could kind of change the grain structure and give it a little bit more strength, which was good enough to work, but not really all that great. At one point, a report from Burton mentions that they were doing their best, but in one particular batch of proofing, they went to proof 32 cylinders, and 18 of them exploded when they were proofed. So they were having serious trouble with materials, among everything else. This was getting pretty discouraging to Spiller and Burr and Burton. By the summer of 1863, Spiller and Burr decided that this had gone far enough, and they tried to get the Confederate government to buy them out. It took until January, at which point the Confederate government did actually buy them out in January of 1864. And at that point, the factory tooling was moved down to Macon, Georgia. At that point, Spiller and Burr had manufactured 700 to 800 revolvers, depending on which source you read. So they'd planned on having 15,000 finished by this point, and what they'd actually produced was a couple hundred. Definitely, this is a project that started with high hopes and kind of naive, patriotic optimism that, we can do anything and the South will win, and sure, we'll make 15,000 revolvers. And it turned into the realities of trying to manufacture a complex product in a wartime economy under embargo and blockade. So this Confederate government, like I said, moved the production facilities down to Georgia, where they did manage to produce a significant additional number of guns. Ultimately, December of 1864, the facility was shut down completely, basically because of the oncoming threat from General Sherman. And by that time, the total production had hit 1,451 of these guns. So initially, the contract, here's a funny way to think about this. Initially, the contract was the first 5,000 guns would be paid for $40 a piece by the Confederate government. When you look at what this ended up actually costing them, even if you leave out everything that was actually paid for the guns directly when they were finished, the Confederate government put in $60,000 and they got 1,451 pistols out of it. One book makes an interesting point that decades ago, when these guns were $1,000 a piece, the collector was still getting them cheaper than the Confederacy had, which is an interesting way to think about it. So why don't I bring the camera back here? Let's take a look at a couple of the details of this. This particular gun is one of the best conditioned Spiller and Burr revolvers out there, so it's a good one to check out. All right, so in general, we have a Whitney pattern revolver here, solid brass frame. It's got a full frame over the top, not an open top like a Colt pattern. Many of the parts on here are literally interchangeable with Whitney's, including, in particular, the loading lever. So this particular Spiller and Burr, it is serial number 239, and on the bottom of the butt here, you can see that it is inscribed to a Dr. Thomas Hill. He was the surgeon for the 3rd Regiment of the North Carolina Artillery, and I think this is probably the only Spiller and Burr that's out there with an original inscription like this. And this may be part of why this gun is in such good condition, is as a surgeon, he probably wasn't throwing this thing down in the mud very often. But very cool to see that particular inscription there, and gives the gun some provenance to a specific officer who would have carried it. Now, I had mentioned that when the first 15 of these revolvers were delivered to the Confederate Ordnance Department, they came back with a couple of improvements they wanted made. So let's take a look at those. First off, the first 15 were actually slightly less than 36 caliber. So one of the changes they wanted was to bring it up to standard 36 caliber, which was done. On the early guns, there was actually like a ball bearing style of latch here on the loading lever. That was deemed not strong enough, and they recommended that it be replaced with a Colt style loading lever, which was done. So they have this style of latch now. So the other major improvement that was recommended was the addition of these safety slots. By having a slot like this between each of the percussion caps, this gives you places to rest the hammer so that you can carry all 6 chambers loaded. This is a 36 caliber 6-shot revolver, but you can carry all 6 loaded and then put the hammer in this slot so that the cylinder won't slip. There we have it on. So here we have it on a chamber. Put it right in the middle, right there. Now we're in between 2 chambers, so the hammer is safe in this position, and hitting the back of the hammer unintentionally won't fire the gun. So all of those changes were made. There are 2 examples of that first batch of 15 that still exist, which make for very interesting reference pieces to see what was changed on the course of production. Now, some Spiller and Burr revolvers will have a CS, a Confederate States mark right here. This one does not. It just kind of seems to be random chance which do and which don't. You will also find, again, kind of at random, a Spiller and Burr stamp on the top of the barrel. Some do, some don't, about 50-50. Doesn't seem to have any connection to serial number. Some of the ones that were made by the government after the factory was bought out and moved do have Spiller and Burr marking. Some that were made literally by Spiller and Burr don't have it. One interesting thing, there are actually 2 of these stamps. One of them had a defect in the E, which you can just see there in Spiller. So you'll find that stamped the same on all the guns. I believe the other one had a defect in one of the R's. So one of the other interesting, kind of neat little detail features of the Spiller and Burr is the front sight post here. It is actually a cone. It's not a simple cylindrical pin. They actually made it conical like this and made out of brass. The rear sight is actually this groove cut in the top strap, which has a matching little cutout in the hammer there. This isn't so much a sight as a matching groove so that you can see the actual rear sight, which is that groove. Not very good sights, but typical of this time period. Finally, an interesting and kind of unexplained detail of the Spiller and Burr is the barrel length, which varies between about 6 and 7 inches without any apparent rhyme or reason. So some are a little longer, some are a little shorter. That's more variation than you would normally expect, even for production at this time period. And there's not really any good reason for it. It just is. Or rather, maybe there is a good reason, but we don't know what it is anymore. So, they did have gain twist rifling, which was also kind of common at the time. Colt revolvers did as well. Well, thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. I find it interesting to look at these Confederate revolvers. You know, it's this neat, getting this behind-the-scenes glimpse, in a way, of what was going on in the South while they were desperately trying to maintain supply lines and keep their troops armed during the Civil War. Now, if you have a collection of Confederate guns or other Confederate memorabilia and you'd like to add this one to it, or if you'd like to start a collection, this would be a fantastic way to start. Go ahead and take a look at the link in the description text below. That will take you to the Julia Auction House's catalog page on it, where you can see their high-res pictures and read their complete description. And if you'd like it, come up here to Maine and participate in the auction live or place a bid online. Thanks for watching.